For 15 years, this official built his career on bribes. He turned a blind eye to cracks in the walls, to rotten ceilings, to rats in the cellars. It was his greed that buried the wife and daughter of a man nicknamed Frank the Quarryman under the ruins of their own flat. But Frank didn't go to the police. He was determined that the culprit should receive the ultimate punishment. Usually, the worst thing for officials is prison. But in this case, the worst part is feeling the industrial concrete slowly squeezing your lungs as the person whose life you ruined sits across from you. Frank read him the obituary of his wife and daughter. The mortar was hardening, turning a living person into stone, and the stonemason. He was in no hurry to go anywhere. This is the story of a man who began as a vigilante and ended up as one of the most methodical killers in New York City history. A story of how justice turns to madness, and about how sometimes the foundations of a city hide more than rebar and rubble. On the 12th of January, 1999, Howard Lenz woke up at 6:15 in the morning as usual. The thermometer outside his flat window in Yonkers read -8. Winter had come early that year and would not let up. Lenz worked as a superintendent for the New York City Department of Buildings. His official salary was $42,000 a year. Unofficial income, 3 times as much. For 15 years, he had turned his position into a small business. Closed violations, expedited inspections, lost complaints. The system worked flawlessly. Those who paid got the signatures they needed. Those who didn't pay waited months. That morning, Lenz drank coffee, kissed his wife, and got into his Buick. The route was familiar, down Broadway to Manhattan, then across the bridge to the Bronx. 3 targets to check out, 2 envelopes in his pocket, an advance for correct conclusions. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he had finished his last inspection, an apartment building on Prospect Avenue in the South Bronx. A 6-story building with cracks in the facade, which he documented as minor, owned by a company connected to the Genovese family. An envelope containing $500 changed hands. Lenz made a note in his notebook and headed for the car. The car park was around the corner in a cul-de-sac between 2 warehouse buildings. It was remote, but Lenz wasn't worried. He'd been here dozens of times. He didn't notice the white van that was parked at the exit. He didn't notice the large man in a work jacket smoking against the wall. He had no time to realize what had happened when a chloroform rag covered his face. The last thing he saw before he passed out was the license plate number of his own Buick. The car will be found in 3 days, Lenz himself in 2 months. By then, he'll have been part of the concrete floor in the basement of an abandoned shop on Hunts Point for 7 weeks. Alive, conscious, unable to move, and Howard Lenz will be just the first of 11. Frank Torrance was born in the year 1952 in Staten Island, the son of a builder and a nurse. His father, William Torrance, was a 3rd-generation bricklayer, a taciturn, stiff man with hands covered with embedded cement dust. He taught his son 2 things: to work with concrete and not to trust the system. Frank's childhood cannot be called traumatic in the classical sense. There were no beatings, no alcohol, no obvious violence. But there was a specific atmosphere, cold, functional, devoid of warmth. Father considered emotions a weakness. His mother worked night shifts and was rarely home. Frank grew up in silence and learned to find comfort in that silence. He kept to himself at school. Not an outcast, not a victim of bullying, just inconspicuous. Teachers later recalled him as a quiet boy who always sat by the window and drew something in his notebook: blueprints, building diagrams, structural plans. In 1970, Frank went into the Army. Vietnam, Corps of Engineers. He built bridges, fortifications, bunkers. He saw people die, but he never killed anyone. The war taught him discipline and made him realize that the world is built on those who build, not those who destroy. After demobilization in '73, he returned to New York. He got a job in construction, married in '78 to Alice Davidson, a quiet woman who worked in the Bronx Library. 2 years later, a daughter, Mary, was born. Frank was described by his colleagues as a reliable worker, not talkative, not ambitious, but extremely competent. He knew concrete better than anyone else on the site. He knew how it behaved at different temperatures, how it reacted to humidity, how long it took to fully cure. The foreman had once said that Frank could feel the mortar the way others felt rain, with his skin. By '89, he was 37 years old. He worked as a foreman on the construction of an apartment complex in the South Bronx. He lived with his family in a rented flat on Caldwell Avenue. Ordinary man, ordinary life. No sign of what was to come. But the system in which he existed was already preparing the point of no return for him. On the 4th of November, 1989th, at 7:40 in the morning, a 6-story apartment building on Fayal Street in the South Bronx collapsed like a house of cards. The building had been built in 1923. By the end of the '80s, it was in need of major repairs, but the owner, a shell company linked to one of the construction unions, had not invested a cent. Tenants' complaints about cracks, leaks, and sagging floors went unanswered for years. Inspectors came, recorded minor violations, and left with envelopes in their pockets. Alice and Mary Torrance lived on the 4th floor. Frank was already at work that morning. His shift started at 6 o'clock. He had heard about the accident from the foreman, who had heard the news on the radio. 17 people died. 43 were injured. The bodies of Alice and 6-year-old Mary were not found under the rubble of the ceiling until 2 days later. The investigation lasted 4 months. The conclusion was that it was an accident caused by the natural wear and tear of the structure. The owner of the building paid token compensation and avoided prosecution. The inspector, who had turned a blind eye to the violations for years, the same Howard Lenz, continued to work as if nothing had happened. Frank attended the hearing. He sat in the last row and was silent. Neighbors who had lost loved ones were shouting, demanding justice, crying. Frank just watched. He watched Lenz testify with a look of boredom on his face, at the lawyers who turned tragedy into paperwork, at the judge who clearly wanted to close the case quickly. Something changed inside Frank that day. Not broken, but changed. For years he had believed that the world was built on those who built. Now he realized that the world is held together by those who avoid responsibility. And if the system refuses to punish the guilty, then someone else must do it for them. He wasn't planning on becoming a killer. He planned to restore balance. 2 months from now, Howard Lenz will disappear from a car park in the South Bronx. And that will be the beginning. Frank Torrance wasn't an impulsive man. He was a builder. And builder's plan. After the cave-in case was closed, he took a 2-week leave of absence, told the foreman he needed time off. No one was surprised. The man had lost his family. Colleagues expressed their condolences and left him alone. Frank spent those 2 weeks traveling. He studied, observing. He made a list. In a small notebook to be found later in a search were names, addresses, routes, habits. 3 men he considered directly responsible for his family's death. Howard Lenz, the inspector who turned a blind eye to violations. Samuel Kovach, who owned the building through a shell company. And Vincent Morelli, a construction union man who supervised the building and received monthly kickbacks for keeping quiet. The first victim was Lenz. Frank didn't pick him at random. The inspector was the most vulnerable link. A predictable route, no security. A habit of parking in remote places, out of sight. Ironically, it was Lenz's caution, his reluctance to shine near the sites where he took bribes. That made him an easy target. The kidnapping took less than a minute. Frank used chloroform purchased through a veterinarian acquaintance on the pretext of putting an old dog to sleep. He rented a white van for cash in New Jersey with a fake license. It's simple. It's elaborate. Frank had found a place to hold the victims back in the autumn. An abandoned industrial facility on Hunts Point, a former dye factory that had closed in '78 after several pollution lawsuits. The building belonged to the city, but no one was interested in it. Perfect location, soundproof, concrete-floored basement, multiple points of entry, no neighbors. Frank spent 3 weeks preparing the basement, installed a generator lighting system. He brought in bags of cement, sand, rebar, built wooden forms, molds for pouring. He prepared as he would for a construction project, because for him it was a project. The method he developed was sophisticated and required professional knowledge. The victim was placed vertically in a formwork, a wooden box about 70 by 70 centimeters in size. Then a special concrete mixture with setting retardants was poured. The mortar rose slowly, centimeter by centimeter, giving Frank time. The pour stopped at chin level. The concrete he used contained additives to ensure gradual compression during curing. Nothing exotic. Standard ingredients available on any construction site. But Frank knew the proportions. He knew how to get the right effect. The chest was under constant, slowly building pressure. Each inhalation required effort. Each exhalation a little harder than the last. He didn't want a quick death. He wanted them to feel. Frank used medical feeding tubes and catheters to keep himself alive. Where he learned how to insert them, the investigation never found out. Maybe books, maybe the experience of caring for his dying father in '84. Either way, it worked. Victims stayed alive for weeks. Lenz was followed by Kovac after 3 weeks, then Morelli another month later. By March 1999, all 3 men Frank believed responsible for the family's death were in the basement of the shop. 3 heads sticking out of the concrete floor. 3 pairs of eyes that watched his every move. And there was a turning point. Frank came to see them every day. First to check on their condition, to change the nutrient solutions, then to talk. He read them the papers. He'd tell them what was happening in the city. New collapses, new casualties of the system, how things continue to rot. He'd bring a thermos of coffee and sit in an old armchair he'd dragged in off the street. He liked the silence, liked that they were listening. He liked the feeling of control. By April, he started coming out to hunt again. But now the selection criteria had changed. The 4th victim was a Prospect Avenue drug dealer, a man Frank saw every day on his way to work. The 5th was a homeless man who, in Frank's opinion, was poisoning the neighborhood. The 6th was a pawn shop owner, suspected of buying stolen goods. The frame of reference had shifted. Frank was no longer looking for specific culprits. He was looking for those who, according to his logic, were destroying society. The line between revenge and something else, something he called cleansing, was completely blurred. By the autumn of the '90s, there were 8 people in the cellar. Some of the first ones had already died. Their bodies couldn't take it. Frank poured a new layer of concrete over the top, turning the dead into a foundation for the next. The police at this time suspected nothing. The disappearances of Lenz, Kovac, and Morelli were investigated as separate cases, and none had progressed beyond the first interviews. A drug dealer and a homeless man didn't make it into the missing person statistics at all. Who cares about people no one is looking for? It was both Frank's strength and weakness. He chose victims whose disappearance wouldn't cause an uproar. But that's why he had no deterrence. The system that allowed him to act with impunity was simultaneously pushing him further and further away. By January of '91, Frank had made his first mistake. The 11th victim was Danny Salazar, a 17-year-old who Frank had spotted graffitiing on the wall of an abandoned warehouse. The boy wasn't a criminal. He was an artist from a poor family who was just looking for a way to express himself. But to Frank, he was a vandal, destroying the face of the city. It was Salazar's disappearance that set off the chain that would eventually lead to exposure. Because Danny had a mother, and she wasn't gonna keep quiet. Maria Salazar worked as a cleaner in 3 places at the same time. She came from Puerto Rico in '72 with $20 in her pocket and a dream to give her future children a better life. Danny was her only son, her everything. When he didn't come home on the evening of 19 January 1991, Maria called all his friends. By midnight, she was at the police station. The officer on duty took a statement without much enthusiasm. A 17-year-old kid from the South Bronx, probably out on a bender or in trouble. The usual stuff. But Maria didn't back down. She came to the station every day. She put up leaflets all over the neighborhood. She contacted the local newspapers. Most of the papers ignored her. The disappearance of a Latino teenager from a poor neighborhood was not sensational. But one reporter from a small neighborhood paper, the Bronx Press, took an interest. His name was Edward Quinn, and he had been collecting stories about missing people in the South Bronx for months. Quinn noticed a strange pattern. Over the past year, at least 9 people have disappeared in Hunts Point and surrounding neighborhoods. Different ages, different social classes, different circumstances. Police have pursued each case separately, and none have been solved. That fact alone was not surprising. People disappeared in the South Bronx all the time. But Quinn noticed something else. All the disappearances were within a 2-mile radius of the Hunts Point industrial area. All on weekdays between 4 and 7 o'clock in the evening. The journalist shared his observations with Detective Alonzo Ramirez of the 41st Precinct. Ramirez was one of those rare police officers who had not yet burned out completely. He looked at the map with the disappearance markers and saw the same thing Quinn had seen. A pattern. Someone was hunting, and that someone knew the area. The investigation was officially merged in early February. Ramirez requested all missing persons files for the last 18 months and began looking for connections. The first lead was Howard Lentz. Unlike the other victims, he had a car, and that car was found. The Buick had been in a municipal impound lot since December of '90. It had been towed from a street, half a mile from the abduction site, but no one connected the car to the owner's disappearance. Ramirez pulled up the CCTV footage from the shop nearest the car park. The quality was abysmal, grainy, black and white. But one of the images showed a white van leaving the alley at about the time Lentz was supposed to have left the site. Van Ramirez began checking commercial vehicle leases in New Jersey and surrounding areas for the period December '89 to January '91. The job took 3 weeks, hundreds of records, dozens of companies, and finally, a match. White Ford Econoline rented for cash on the 12th of January, 1990. Name on the paperwork is William Davis. Fake license as it turned out later. But the address on the lease was real. A rental flat in the South Bronx. A flat left 2 months earlier by a man named Frank Torrance. Ramirez found out that Torrance had lost his family in the collapse of the Fale Street house in November of '89. That he worked as a construction foreman. That among the missing was Howard Lentz, the inspector in charge of inspecting the collapsed building. The connection was obvious, but there was not enough evidence to make an arrest. The breakthrough was due to a power bill. The abandoned shop on Hunts Point had been without power since 1999. But in January of '91, someone had hooked up a generator to it, and that generator was consuming fuel. A lot of fuel. Ramirez checked the nearest petrol stations and found a witness. The owner of a petrol station on Randall Avenue remembered a large man who bought 4 jerry cans of diesel every week. Paid cash. Always kept his mouth shut. On the 27th of February, 1991st, the raiding party entered the building of the former dye factory. Frank Torrance was sitting in the basement, in an old armchair, with a thermos in his hands. He didn't resist, didn't try to run. Just looked at the policeman and said he'd been waiting for them. What they saw in the basement prompted 3 officers to come forward. One of them, a 20-year veteran who had been through the worst years of the crack epidemic, later resigned from the police force and never worked in law enforcement again. There were heads sticking out of the concrete floor. 11 heads. 8 of them were still alive. They were blinking. Some tried to say something, but their ligaments had atrophied from the long silence. Danny Salazar was among the living. He had spent 39 days in the concrete. The rescue operation took 14 hours. The concrete was cut out with diamond saws, millimeter by millimeter, to avoid damaging the bodies. 5 survivors were hospitalized in critical condition. 3 of them died over the next week of multi-organ failure. 2, including Danny Salazar, survived but were left with lifelong disabilities. Frank Torrance watched the rescue operation from a police car. According to the officer who guarded him, he showed no emotion. Only once, when the body of Howard Lenz, the first who had died back in March of '90, was brought out of the basement, Frank nodded faintly, as if to confirm that the job was finished. The trial of Frank Torrance began in September 1991 and lasted until January '92. The case was heard in the New York State Supreme Court, but did not attract widespread media attention. In those months, the city was busy with other news: the economic downturn, the ongoing war on drugs, the political scandals at City Hall. A story about a construction worker who had been burying people in concrete flashed across the back pages of the tabloids and was quickly forgotten. The defense argued insanity. 3 psychiatrists examined Torrance and came to different conclusions. 1. Diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, caused by the loss of his family. Another diagnosed paranoid personality disorder. A third stated that the defendant was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Frank himself refused to plead insanity. He insisted that he had acted knowingly and purposely. When asked by the prosecutor if he was remorseful, Torrance said he was only sorry for Danny Salazar. The kid didn't deserve it. The others did. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict: guilty on all counts. 11 counts of kidnapping, 8 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted murder. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole. The judge, in announcing the judgment, noted that in 40 years of practice, he had never met an offense that combined such a degree of planning with such a degree of cruelty. Frank Torrance was sent to Attica Correctional Institution in February of the 92nd year. He is reportedly still alive, although information about prisoners of his status is rarely made public. He is now 73 years old. Danny Salazar survived the ordeal but never fully recovered. Prolonged chest compression caused permanent damage to his lungs. He died in 2008 year of respiratory failure. Maria Salazar continued to live in the South Bronx until her death in 2019. She never gave interviews and refused to talk about what happened to her son. Neighbors recalled that every January 19th, the anniversary of Danny's disappearance, she lit a candle in the window and did not leave the house. Detective Alonzo Ramirez received a commendation from the department and a promotion to sergeant. He continued to work for the NYPD until 2003, at which time he retired and moved to Florida. In a rare interview, he said that the Torrance case was the only one in his career that he tried not to remember. The former dye factory on Hunts Point was demolished in 1995. A warehouse complex was built in its place. The basement was filled with concrete, this time permanently. As for the system that allowed all this to happen, it has remained largely unchanged. The investigation into corruption in the Department of Construction, initiated after the Torrance case, did not lead to serious results. Several inspectors resigned at will. The new inspection rules remained on paper. Buildings in the South Bronx continued to collapse, although less frequently than in the 80s. This case was not a game changer. It didn't change the system. It just ended, like thousands of other cases in the big city. The file went into the archives, The names of the victims forgotten. Frank Torrance became a line on the prison registry. But if anything remains of this story, it's one thought. The line between justice and madness is not where we are used to seeing it. It passes through the moment when a person decides that he or she has the right to judge. And when that moment comes, there is no turning back. This was the story of Frank Torrance, a man who wanted to restore balance and turned into what he was trying to fight.